carbon dates are not infallible. When we hear carbon dates which appear to conflict with what the Bible says, we need just to check for a moment and think what assumptions were made in that carbon date. Dinosaurs are supposed to have died out 65 million years ago. No way could there be any carbon-14 inside a dinosaur bone, and yet, consistently, there it is. To find carbon-14 inside a diamond means that the diamonds cannot possibly be billions of years old.
So we could say that dinosaur bones, coal and diamonds are all a creationist's best friend.
Absolutely.
So how do evolutionists respond to this? Could carbon dating actually support a young Earth? I'm speaking today with Dr Mark Harwood from Ministries International. You've worked in the aerospace industry for over 30 years and you have a PhD in electromagnetics. Mark, you believe carbon dating is a friend of creationists. Why do you say that?
Well, I say that, Bronte, because it turns up in places where it shouldn't. At least that shouldn't be there in the evolutionary understanding of the history of the world. And the reason that's important is that carbon-14 can't stay around for very long, so it discredits that idea of millions and millions of years.
It seems like a strong battle line is drawn here between evolutionists and creationists, particularly around the age of the Earth.
That's true, and in fact that's, I suppose, one of the most critical issues in this whole debate today. But to be able to explain how carbon dating is a friend of creationists, I'd like to do a few things, if I may. First of all, we need to understand how it works, and then to talk about some examples where it's actually failed to make a prediction in relatively recent history, and some attempts people have made to use carbon dating to discredit the Bible.
So that's really interesting that people have used carbon dating to try and discredit the Bible. How have they tried to do that?
Well, there are a number of cases. One that comes to mind quickly, and we'll discuss it in a bit more detail later. There was an archaeologist called Kathleen Kenyon in the 1950s who was excavating around Jericho, and she did some carbon dating on some of the things they found and concluded that the destruction of Jericho had happened some centuries before the Exodus itself, which she claimed showed that the whole story of Joshua fighting the Battle of Jericho was just a myth. And Egyptian artefacts have been carbon dated as being before the biblical date of the global flood of Noah. And if that's true, then the Bible's record of history once again would be wrong. So these are cases where carbon dating has been used to try and discredit the authority and the accuracy of the Bible.
Okay. Let's get into the science. What is carbon-14 dating and how does it work?
Well, carbon-14 is produced in the upper atmosphere through high-energy gamma rays coming into our upper atmosphere, which, by the way, the atmosphere consists of mostly nitrogen. About 78% of it is nitrogen. And you get a high-energy neutron hitting a nitrogen atom, and it changes it into a carbon atom. And what defines what an element is the number of protons in its nucleus. So nitrogen has 7, carbon has only 6. So if one of those protons is knocked out, then nitrogen becomes carbon. And it acquires another neutron, so it becomes carbon-14. Now, carbon normally has 6 protons and 6 neutrons, so it's carbon-12 is the normal, stable form of carbon. Carbon-14, though, still behaves like carbon, so it reacts with oxygen to produce carbon dioxide, but it's radioactively unstable because its nucleus is too heavy. So over time, it decays away and it becomes nitrogen-14 again. So the way it works is that the carbon in the upper atmosphere reacts with oxygen, so we have some carbon dioxide, which most of it actually is C12 with oxygen, but some of it is C14 with oxygen. That carbon dioxide is absorbed by plants because carbon dioxide is actually plant food. And so when animals eat the plants, they get some carbon-14 as well as carbon-12 into their bodies. Now, the carbon-14 is always decaying back to nitrogen, but it gets replaced as the animal eats and breathes. And then, of course, we eat plants or we eat animals which have eaten plants. So we end up with carbon-14 and carbon-12 in our bodies as well.
So we have some carbon-14 in us.
We do, right now. Now, very little, though. I should say that today there's approximately one carbon-14 atom for about 1.25 trillion carbon-12 atoms. Now, a trillion is like 1,000 billion, right? So it's very, very tiny little fraction. Now, all that's well and good, but let's say now a living organism, an animal, a person dies. Now they, of course, are no longer breathing, they're no longer eating, so they're not replacing the carbon-14 in their bodies. So what was there at the time of death starts to decay away. So by very careful measurement, scientists can measure how much carbon-14 remains in the specimen, be it a fossil or a bone or whatever. And the principle is they can then calculate how long ago that organism died. So it only applies to living things, to plants, to animals, to people, and so on.
So can carbon-14 be used to date things as millions of years old?
Well, no, it can't. That's a common misunderstanding. You often hear people say, but the Earth is millions of years old because carbon dating proves it. Well, in fact, it can't do that. And the reason it can't is that carbon-14 decays back to nitrogen-14 quite rapidly, relatively speaking, to other radiometric dating methods. So, for instance, it takes about 5,730 years for half of the original amount of carbon-14 to decay to nitrogen-14. So after another 5,700 years, you would have a half of the original half. So you're now down to a quarter in, what would that be, 11,400 years. I should never do arithmetic on the fly, but you get the point. So every 5,700 years, you halve the amount of carbon-14. What that means is it will be undetectable after about maybe 60 to 80,000 years. In fact, one of my colleagues pointed out once, if you had a block of carbon-14 the size of planet Earth, it would all decay away in less than 1 million years. So then you think about that, as the size of planet Earth, and it would decay away to nothing in less than 1 million years. So there's no way carbon-14 can give results that are millions and millions of years long. It's only in the order of tens of thousands.
So that's quite incredible. You're saying that carbon-14 can't actually date anything as millions of years because that's outside its scope.
Absolutely, yeah. It's the process is too fast to be able to do that. So it only applies to living things and it only works for tens of thousands of years.
So can we trust carbon-14 dates? How exactly are they calibrated?
Before we continue, a quick heads up. Stick around until the end of the interview because we'll be offering an exclusive free ebook, the Creation Answers book, packed with biblical answers to over 60 important questions about creation, evolution, and the Bible. You won't want to miss it. Now back to the interview.
Well, that's a very good question too. With any dating method, you have to know whether or not the results you're getting are actually right. So how do you test that? Well, what we need is a time in history which has a known date that we're very, very confident about. So there's a couple of problems here straight away. One is that human history only extends back about 4,000 years. So we don't have anything that we can unambiguously date that's further back than that. That's the first problem. So scientists look at different ways to overcome this. They look at things like tree rings, for instance. And by counting the rings on a tree, they believe that these occur annually, so you can count backwards in time. And there are various patterns that you find in those things that reflect different climactic kind of effects, whether they're very wet seasons or droughts or what have you. And you can match those reasonably well. And so they try and overlap them and go further and further and further and further back. Unfortunately, though, it's not quite as easy as that. And one of the reasons is that the assumption that tree rings are annual is a questionable assumption.
So it's not necessarily true?
That's exactly right, because a tree ring actually reflects differential growth rates in the tree. So if you have a particularly wet season, for instance, it might do a lot of growing. If you have a spell that's very dry, it'll not grow so much. So the density of the wood is different. And so the tree ring is really a measure of growth rate. Now, a colleague of mine showed me some charts. He was a dendrochronologist. That's a person who looks at tree rings to provide dates and so on. And he had a record over some 7 or 8 years, which showed tree rings with an average of about 4 every year, simply reflecting different growth rates. So the assumption that they are annual is a questionable assumption to start with. But then trying to overlap them to get a continual record of tree rings for many thousands of years is problematic, because the scientist then has to use their judgment about, well, that one doesn't really work, so I won't use that, or here's one that seems to fit, so we'll use that. And so subjectivity comes into that process.
So even though people do try and calibrate results using carbon-14, there are a lot of assumptions involved in those calculations.
There are assumptions made. There's another method that is used, and by the way, I'm not trying to discredit the scientists. They're genuinely trying to calibrate this method because they want to get good results, right? Everybody does. Another approach is to look at coral growth patterns. But there again, it's problematic because corals, a lobe of coral can grow over another one, and you get diebacks and all sorts of things. So once again, it's a challenge to try and do the correlations. And there are also marine effects which have to be taken into account. Coral experts, marine biologists, point out that in fact this is fraught with difficulty and assumptions again. And there's a third method which looks at layers of sediment in the bottom of lakes. One particular lake in Japan is very famous for this. And scientists have taken a core drill, in fact several, and they believe they can count up to 70,000 annual layers of sediment. Now, that's extraordinary. If you think about it, Japan is earthquake prone. It defies credibility that this would have been a calm environment for 70 years without any disturbance. 70,000 years, An earthquake would surely have stirred these up. Also, once again, we have the assumption of annual deposition of these layers, and the layers don't extend across the whole of the lake. Now, there's one really interesting part about this, because 2 of these drill cores were compared, and there were separate volcanic eruptions that took place a certain number of years apart. But in one core, there were more layers, more valves, as they're called, between the volcanic ash layers than was the case in another core. So that tells us that it isn't so straightforward an arrangement at all. So one has to call in question such large numbers as 70,000 layers in such an environment. Nonetheless, a lot of work goes into trying to make these fit. But there's a problem here, because what the scientist is trying to do is to cover many tens of thousands of years in the belief that these tens of thousands of years actually exist. So there's, if you will, a set of glasses, if you like, a set of lenses that they're looking at the data through. And that lens is the belief that the millions and millions of years of Earth history are true, and they're looking for evidence to support, in the case of carbon dating, many, many tens of thousands of years.
Mark, I've heard of a calibration curve. Can you explain to us what that is?
Well, what the calibration curve does is takes these different things, the tree rings, the coral growth, the valves in lakes, and tries to incorporate them into a device to transform a radiocarbon date, and that's what comes out of the measurements of carbon-14 and the calculations associated with it. Transform that radiocarbon date into a calendar date. Because at the end of the day, what people want is a calendar date. When did this thing die, for instance? Was it in 1232 BC or so on? So that calibration curve is how that conversion is made. Now, if it was a nice linear straight line, it would be lovely, but it's not. It's quite complicated. There are parts of this calibration curve which wander about, and in fact, for one radiocarbon date, you can have 3 or 4 possible dates because the curve, meanders. It's not a nice straight linear curve. So not only do you get, in some cases, multiple calendar dates for one radiocarbon date, but there's also a whole region, it's around 400 to 800 AD, where the curve is almost flat, which means you can get any date you like in that range. And this is really unfortunate, because in that period we have things like, for instance, the divided kingdom of Israel happens then. We have the exile, we have Babylonian civilization, we have the Persians, Assyrians. Major events in Greek history are occurring in this region. And carbon dating is completely useless. So it's a great, not an embarrassment, but it's an inconvenience, I think. Not for this method simply doesn't work because the calibration curve has a big flat spot in it.
So there's almost, you said 400 years?
Something in that order, yes, 800 to 400 BC.
So Mark, is there a reliable and accurate calibration curve that we have access to today?
Well, the one that I've just described, it's called the IntCal 20, but it is reasonably good for the last couple of thousand years, except there are still factors that have to be taken into account and are taken into account. An interesting one, for instance, is called the bomb effect. Back in the 1950s, various nations were testing atomic bombs in the upper atmosphere. And those nuclear explosions produced a tremendous burst of energy into the upper atmosphere, turning those nitrogen atoms into carbon atoms and carbon-14 atoms. So there's a big spike in the carbon-14 to carbon-12 ratio, and that's now settling down. But if you don't account for that, you will get the wrong results from a carbon-14 dating exercise. But there's another one too, and that is at the beginning of the 1800s. In the 1800s, you have the Industrial Revolution taking place, and large amounts of fossil fuels were being burnt, putting a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But carbon dioxide, which was depleted of carbon-14 because it was taken from under the ground, buried, presumably, in Noah's flood. So it's very old. So that would have decreased the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12. So these factors need to be taken into account to sharpen up this calibration curve.
Mark, would you trust ages derived from this calibration curve?
I would, with caution. And I say that because even with all those factors taken into consideration, there are still assumptions which have to be made. And one of the most important is that the C12-C14 ratio is known at the time of the death of the creature concerned. Now, there's a fascinating example recently where the carbon dating got it wrong. And it was really interesting. There was in around the late 800s AD, around 870 something or other, there was a group of Scandinavian Vikings had come into Derbyshire in England, and they'd wintered there. And that's a matter of the historical record. People observed it and they wrote it down, so we know that's when it happened. Now, a mass grave was found that had something like 250 to 300 different individuals in this grave, and people did some carbon dating on the bones and discovered that the bones actually dated back a couple of centuries earlier, like around 600 AD. So they were pretty sure these were the Vikings, but something was wrong because there's no historical record of the Vikings being in Derbyshire in 600, but there was an historical record of them being there in the 800s. So this great debate ensued. Were the scientists right? Were the historians right? And the scientists said, no, carbon dating is a wonderful method. It gives accurate results. So they stood their ground, and the historians say, but there's no record of Vikings there in the 600s, but they were there in the late 800s. And then somebody woke up to what the solution was. Turns out the Vikings have a largely seafood diet. Interestingly, fish, shellfish and finfish, have less carbon-14 in them than land-dwelling animals and plants do, simply because of the rate of absorption of carbon into the oceans and various marine effects. So the diet that these Vikings had was actually deficient, if you like, in carbon-14, which made their bones look a couple of hundred years older than they really were.
So their diet affected the carbon-14 date reading?
That's right. So we get a carbon-14 date a couple hundred years earlier than the historical date. But there's a very important lesson that emerges out of this, and that is that the authority always goes to the historical record, not to science. And if you think about it, science is about observing things in the present so we can understand how the universe works. But you cannot observe the past. So in a very real sense, dealing with historical events is actually outside of the competence of the scientist. He has to be able to do repeatable experiments, which are always done in the present. So when you're dealing with the past, the scientist has to make assumptions, like we know the C14 to C12 ratio when that particular specimen died. But maybe we don't, as in the case of the Vikings. So the historical record is always in authority over the scientific result of an experiment when we're dealing with the past.
So, Mark, you're saying that when we try and date using carbon-14, we're making a lot of assumptions before we can calculate the age.
That's right. Even with all the efforts to try and limit those assumptions, they're still there, and something can come up that we have not thought about. So history is always the reference point, the historical record. Now, I believe that in the Bible we have a written historical record of what God did right from the very beginning of creation, which is why the Bible's record of history is the authority, I believe, and we need to apply that to all of our scientific thinking when we're addressing things in the past.
Now, earlier you mentioned that carbon-14 is the friend of creationists. Why did you say that?
Well, it crops up in places where it shouldn't. And let me give you some examples. Coal is supposedly tens to hundreds of millions of years old in the evolutionary paradigm, the story of evolution. So no doubt, of course, there could be no carbon-14 present because, as we've seen earlier, it only survives for tens of thousands of years, not for millions. But a range of samples of coal were tested for the presence of carbon-14. And people can find articles on this in detail on our website at creation.com. Interestingly, every one of those samples that was tested had significant levels of carbon-14 present. Not just background levels or impurities, but substantial amounts which gave quite accurate, reasonable results within the capability of the equipment doing the measurements.
So that would imply that they were much younger than millions of years.
Absolutely. So they can't be millions of years old if carbon-14 is still there. Even more dramatically, a set of diamonds was sampled for the presence of carbon-14. Now, diamonds in the evolutionary story of history are believed to be anywhere between 1 and 3 billion years old. 1,000 million years old. I mean, no way could carbon-14 be found inside a diamond if that were true. Now, bear in mind, diamond is the hardest naturally occurring form of carbon that we have. You can't get impurities into or out of a diamond through natural processes. So, of course, no one had ever bothered to test for carbon-14 in a diamond because obviously it wouldn't be there, would it? Until some people took a variety of diamonds and sent them off to different dating laboratories. Every single one had significant quantities of carbon-14. That proves that the diamonds cannot be billions of years old. So it completely upends the whole idea of deep time, if you like, the millions of years.
So you would say that when we find carbon-14 in coal or in diamonds, that this is much more in line with a biblical timeline?
Absolutely, because it contracts the dates for those objects down to only thousands of years. And that's the extent, if you will, of biblical history. The Bible, if we take it as it's written, would indicate that the age of the earth is about 6,000 years. In Genesis chapter 5, it gives us a list, and it shows the age of the father when the son next in line is born. And you can just add those numbers up straightforwardly and discover that from the time of creation to the time of Abraham is about 2,000 years. From the time of Abraham to the time of Jesus is also about 2,000 years. And from the time of Jesus to the present day, of course, is about 2,000 years. So according to the Bible, here we stand about 6,000 years later. So the whole of the history of the earth is only measured in terms of thousands of years according to the Bible. And there's another place where carbon-14 turns up embarrassingly for the evolutionary story, and that's in the bones of dinosaurs. Now, dinosaurs are supposed to have died out 65 million years ago. No way could there be any carbon-14 inside a dinosaur bone, and yet, consistently, there it is. There are many secular scientific papers now reporting the presence of carbon-14, of soft tissue, blood vessels, red blood cells, collagen fibres, osteocytes, proteins, all sorts of things which cannot survive for millions and millions of years. And there they are in dinosaur bones, along with carbon-14.
Is that because they would decay?
Exactly, they would fall apart. And all the laws of physics and chemistry tell us that they won't survive for millions of years. Now, by the laws of physics and chemistry, I mean the things that we can do in laboratories, that we can observe, we can measure, not stories about the unobserved past. I mean observable science, that's real science. And it all tells us that they won't last anything like millions of years, and yet there they are. So carbon-14 is a very significant embarrassment, I think, for the whole idea of millions and millions of years.
So we could say that dinosaur bones, coal and diamonds are all a creationist's best friend.
Absolutely. That's a very good description.
So how do evolutionists respond to this?
Well, of course, they find, first of all, they push back and say, no, there must have been impurities in the measurement, or something went wrong, or whatever. They look for some kind of reason to discount the young ages that are being produced. Those things actually are a little bit insulting to the laboratories that do these measurements, because these people are professionals and they do an excellent job. They don't allow impurities to be added and so on. They take extreme precautions to ensure that does not happen. And so when that fails, then they've come up with some ideas. Well, maybe there's some mechanism that we don't yet know about that preserves these soft tissues for millions of years. And someone suggested that maybe the presence of the element iron might do that. But every attempt to build a model for how iron would preserve these soft tissue actually doesn't pass examination. So they fail. But even if there was something like that, that doesn't answer the carbon-14 question, because that just decays away at a half-life of 5,730 years inexorably. So you can't prop that up by some kind of preservation mechanism. So the other method is to just dismiss it. And there's a very interesting article in the American Biology Teacher, I think was the magazine or the journal. And they made some outrageous statements. They were trying to prepare biology teachers for how to deal with students who would come into their science class and say, I've just discovered that carbon-14 has been found in dinosaur bones. And what they said was along the lines of carbon-14 dating gives notoriously inaccurate results on bones and is an unreliable method. That's just a bald statement without any support, but it's an outrageous statement. If that was true, the whole of the archaeological community should be up in arms, because they make a lot of use of carbon-14 dating. And then it goes on and says Mesozoic, meaning dinosaur age bones, regularly give false radiocarbon dates. But that's no help to anybody. It doesn't explain why. And as I said, that just flies in the face of all the work that people have done prior.
So we see that carbon-14 is actually giving much younger dates than what evolutionists are hoping for. But it also seems to be giving slightly longer dates than perhaps creationists are looking for. How do we reconcile that?
Well, that's a very good question. And the sorts of dates we get are often 30 to 50,000 years old for the sample, for instance. Now, there are two key factors that I don't think are taken into account One I know definitely isn't, and the other I doubt is, which must be taken into account. The first of those is the fact that the Earth's magnetic field is decaying quite rapidly. Now, you may be thinking, what on earth has that got to do with carbon-14 dating? But the Earth is surrounded by like a protective magnetic field which deflects those gamma rays I spoke of at the beginning and deflects most of them away. So that reduces the number which are impacting our upper atmosphere atoms of nitrogen and producing carbon-14. Now, because the Earth's magnetic field is decaying, and it's doing so, by the way, at the rate of something like 4 or 5% per century, it's weakening in its intensity. So to put a perspective on that, if you went backwards to the time of Jesus, the magnetic field would be about 2.5 times greater than what it is now. If you go back to the time of the flood, it would be probably 7 times greater than it is now. And you go back to the time of creation on the biblical timescales of 6,000 years ago, it would be somewhere around 15 times more powerful than it is today. So as it decreases in intensity, more and more gamma rays penetrate the upper atmosphere. That means we're producing more and more carbon-14. So the carbon-14 to carbon-12 ratio is not in equilibrium. It's constantly climbing. Now, that's a very important factor, and if that's not taken into account, then ages which are derived from carbon-14 will appear to be longer than they really are. So we have more carbon-14 today, and because the sample shows less carbon-14, it will appear to be older, if that makes sense. The second factor, which is profoundly important, is the true history of the Earth, as laid out in the Bible. So let's take a look at what it says. We had the creation about 6,000 years ago. The Bible tells us it was a perfect creation. Pretty reasonable, I think, to assume there was no carbon-14 present in the biosphere right at the very beginning. Man rebels against God. The fall takes place. God withdraws some of his sustaining power. And we find now that universally everything runs down. Entropy or disorder is increasing. And that's a reflection of the curse that God put onto the earth because of Adam's sin. So it seems reasonable then that the presence of carbon-14 would have started to increase. Now, the flood was only about 1,600 years after creation. So by then, there still was not much carbon-14 in the atmosphere, not much carbon-14, therefore, in living organisms. So all the fossils that we find buried at the flood would have started with very small amounts of carbon-14, very small compared to today. So the ratio of C14 to C12 would be tiny. Now, that, of course, when we look at them today, would make them appear to be much older than they necessarily are. After the flood, or rather during the flood, an enormous amount of vegetation was swept by the floodwaters and buried and then encased down under sediments and rocks and so on. So much of the biosphere was removed and the carbon was buried, and that is what we now find today in our coal deposits, oil and gas and so on. That would have removed, at the same time, a substantial amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. We still have approximately the same amount of carbon-14 because that's coming, remember, from outside the Earth, the gamma rays impacting our upper atmosphere, but less carbon-12. So that would have led to an increase in the carbon-14 to carbon-12 ratio. And then with the decaying magnetic field, we see a continual increase in the rate of production of carbon-14. So today, we would have a much higher carbon-14 to carbon-12 ratio than there would have been immediately prior to the flood. So that has the effect of magnifying the carbon-14 dates. So that means that dates in the range of 30 to 50,000 years from carbon dating would most likely map back into that year-long flood.
So, Mark, the two factors that aren't often considered are the decay in the Earth's magnetic field and also the inconstant rate of carbon-14 to carbon-12 ratio. Is that correct?
Yes, but the latter because of the flood, which involves belief in biblical history. So if the secularist rejects the Bible, which they generally do, then there's no way they're going to account for the flood in their carbon-14 calibrations.
So let me take you back to these examples of Jericho and of Egypt that you mentioned earlier. Can you talk to us about them?
Well, Kathleen Kenyon, back in the 1950s, used a carbon date to claim that the destruction of Jericho happened earlier than the Exodus even took place, thereby discrediting the Bible. Now, in the 1950s, this was a very new technique. It was really only developed in the 1940s, and a lot of the calibration considerations had not been taken into account, not the least of which is the decaying Earth's magnetic field, and certainly not a belief in the global flood of Noah. But, you know, had she taken those factors into account, her ages would have contracted, and I suspect she probably went out on a bit of a limb rather too early, because now I believe you would find those dates would in fact line up. But it's an interesting point of philosophy here, because we know when those events took place from the historical record. So we have an historical anchor point. So that, if you like, is like a calibration point. That is, if you believe it's historically accurate. But what's happened is we've inverted it. We've elevated the scientific process, the carbon dating, to having authority over the Bible, rather than the other way up, if you follow what I mean. So when you start with the Bible as the authority, that historical account now gives us a data point with which we could calibrate the carbon dating method. If you start with science as the authority, you end up saying, aha, the Bible's wrong. And that's what came out of Kathleen Kenyon's work in the 1950s. Similarly, the Egyptian artefacts you spoke about. Obviously, there could be nothing on the face of the earth that predates the flood. The Bible makes it absolutely clear it was a total devastation of the surface of the earth. And when we look at the geological record and look at the stunning depth of sedimentary rock deposits, it's clear confirmation of a global watery catastrophe, exactly consistent with the Bible's record of Noah's flood. So if you take that into account, there cannot possibly be anything to do with Egyptian history or artefacts before the flood. So once again, we have a data point from the biblical record against which we need to calibrate the radiocarbon dating method. But if you start with the dating method as the authority, then you say, the Bible must be wrong. So it's what do we take as the authority? Is it God's word, or is it man's attempt to reconstruct the past by making observations in the present? And as always, when you make observations in the present, you rely on assumptions, unprovable assumptions about the past. And therein lies the whole nub of the issue, I think, of the debate between long ages versus biblical ages.
So, Mark, what would you say is the takeaway message from our discussion today about carbon-14 dating?
Well, I think one of the most important points is for people to understand that carbon dates are not infallible. That when we hear carbon dates which appear to conflict with what the Bible says, we need just to check for a moment and think, well, what really is the truth? What was really found? What assumptions were made in that carbon date? I believe that the Bible is God's eyewitness account of what he actually did right from the very beginning. Therefore, it is in fact the truth, and that becomes our reference point. So when we apply that to the observations we make, we can, if you like, calibrate the dating methods, because they cannot produce ages of things which are older than the entire universe, for instance. But here's the problem. What do we take as our authority? You see, if the millions and millions of years of evolutionary history are true, that inevitably places the process of suffering and death and misery and so on for millions of years before mankind even appears on the scene. So what that means is that when Adam and Eve were in the garden, even if they were, or even if they existed, because most people don't believe they did because of the evolutionary story, but if they did, then their rebellion against God would have had no effect because suffering and death was already in the world. So why then did Jesus go to the cross for us? The Bible makes it very plain. He went to the cross to pay the price for our rebellion against God, and that price is death. What was the rebellion? Adam and Eve rebelled, and into an otherwise perfect world they brought suffering, death and disease. That's why the last Adam came to pay the price for the first Adam's sin. So can you see that these seemingly unrelated things like the age of the earth and radiocarbon dates actually impact onto the very gospel message itself? And that, I think, is the key takeaway message. The authority in all things has to be God's word, because God's word makes sense of all of history, and the account of the fall and the flood and then Jesus coming to pay the price for our sin is what the gospel message is actually all about.
If someone listening was intrigued by what you shared today or perhaps unconvinced, where could they go for more information?
Well, the best place is an absolute goldmine of information on our website at creation.com. And it has an amazing search function there which gives you access to something like 14,000 different articles that cover every aspect of this debate between the creation account and the evolution account and what is true. It covers historical aspects, it covers scientific, philosophical and theological. So it's a wonderful resource to go to, creation.com.
If you've enjoyed watching this, you're going to want to check out the Creation Answers book, packed with biblical answers to over 60 important questions about creation, evolution, and the Bible. And if you want to get a copy of the free ebook, follow the link in the description.
Mark, this has been fascinating. Thank you for your time.
You're welcome, Roti.